Frustrated and confused about racism issues in America? No worries. Watch this video for my easy to understand guide on the history and theories of racism. For the most awesome advice on activism, the arts, and entrepreneurship, please subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so that you can be updated every time I post a new video every Tuesday. Okay, so are you confused about everything that's going on with Donald Trump and all of these different protests and right, left, Colin Kaepernick taking knees, all these different issues of race? You have people saying these color lives matter. You have other people saying that there is no racism, they don't see color. So like, what is going on? By the end of this video, you will have a clear understanding, not only of the mental components that make up racism, but also the history and social conditioning that contributed to it. So first, we're going to start with slavery, but we're not going to look at it through the normal lens of specifically what happened during those times that you see in a lot of the movies and the roots and like all these different things where folks really depict the horrible crimes against humanity that happened to people of color who were enslaved. What we're actually going to look at is what happened economically that created a need for slaves. So if you read the book, The New Jim Crow, which talks about the prison industrial complex, which we're going to get into a little bit later in the video, there's also going to be a link in the description to the book by Michelle Alexandra if you want to check that book out. But yeah, in the beginning of the book, she talks about how we got to a place where people of color are more, overly represented in the justice system, right? So she talks about slavery and how way back when there were different forms of indentured servitude before we went to a complete slave-based system with Africans being the primary slaves. And what she talks about is that there was a demand for more products such as cotton and tobacco. So that created a demand and need for more land from the planter class. The planter class would be the 1% if we were to look at it through today's lenses. So what they did was they went and got more slaves. First they conquered more indigenous lands, then they went and got more slaves. The thing that really happened to shift indentured servitude to a straight up slave-based system was Bacon's Rebellion. So at first a lot of different folks were indentured servants. It wasn't just people of color, but after Bacon's Rebellion, where a white man actually organized and brought together all different indentured servants and slaves of different colors, and it was a ridiculous uprising that lasted for a while and sparked a lot of different uprisings. So as they're expanding their business, the planter class, that is, they wanted to ensure that something like that couldn't happen again. So they started to look for more vulnerable slaves, folks that didn't speak the language, that were of course coming from different countries, and they also wanted to make sure that that can never happen again. So they started to create division between people of color who are poor and people who aren't of color who are poor by giving more privileges and different social statuses, a little bit like more pay to white poor people. So that is how it mostly all started, where there became a superiority complex that made it almost impossible for that to happen again. And then slavery continued to expand. The next thing we're going to talk about is the prison industrial complex, which comes directly out of slavery. There's actually a documentary by PBS that I'm going to put in the description as well that you can see for free, and it's called Slavery by Another Name. The reason that it's called that is because after they built this big economy on slaves and then slavery ended, the South's economy kind of collapsed. So they had to find a way to get more free labor, right? So if you look at also movies like 13th, where they talk about how, and this isn't like, a lot of folks like to say that it's like some conspiracy theory or whatever, but it isn't. Like, if folks are like 13th Amendment, they can't be slaves unless you have been convicted of a crime and like you're a prisoner. So what happened in the South was folks around this time, after their economy collapsed and they needed slave labor essentially to build, they started looking through that loophole, and they saw that if folks were arrested and incarcerated and they were able to incarcerate more people, then they could have more slave labor and they could of course make more money. So that is how the prison industrial complex started, but it goes a little bit deeper than that because it came with a social conditioning. Not only were they overcharging and over sentencing folks, but they had to justify it to the public. So they also talk about that in Slavery by Another Name. I'll let you check that out for yourself. But in order to justify the over incarceration of people of color, they had to market them as criminals and untrustworthy and things like that. Before this happened, actually, like, and you can kind of just use common sense to put this together if you were like, you know, slaves or had those low paying jobs where you see like, you know, the old school photos or videos of like the man that's taking care of the white household and the white children and stuff. Like, in order to do that, people would probably have to trust you. That's just common sense. But historically, factually, black people were looked at as trustworthy and good citizens and things like that before the prison industrial complex started. So they started to demonize people of color and they started overcharging, put them into the system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So now what I want to talk about is a point in history that is like, you know, right around the time of key to the civil rights movement actually was the assassination of Martin Luther King. My timeline is kind of on point actually. That was in the right order. Yes. But after Martin Luther King was assassinated, a teacher and social activist legend named Jane Elliott, she had a class full of white kids, and the kids wanted to understand why someone would do that. So, excuse me. So, Jane Elliott, the teacher, she decided to do an exercise to teach them about racism. So this is called the eye color exercise, I believe. I give you the Cliff Notes version. I will leave the link in the description for you to check it out yourself. But pretty much what she did was she separated the class and by eye color, and a certain eye color she would treat as if they were white, meaning they get more special privileges. They were spoken to better and like all those different type of things, and then she would treat another group of eye color as if they were black, and you know they were like ridiculed in front of the other students, and like, you know, they lost privileges and those different type of things. And what she saw over time was that the white group, they started to thrive in areas that they normally wouldn't have and like hadn't in the past. They also became like arrogant and bossy and treated the black kids really mean, and this has to do with superiority complexes. And then you saw the other group who were black, they started to do worse on stuff that they actually used to do good on. Their self-esteem, like, you know, hit rock bottom. They kind of like stayed to themselves, and like, you know, they just became very docile. So then she switched it, and she started to see a little bit of the same results from the white kids who were black at first, but they weren't as mean or as overboard with it as the initial white group of kids. So what that gets into is the mentality, the mental behind racism, and like what is it really scientifically, like what is it? So there was another study, this is what we're on 3 or 4, I think we're on like 4. Stanford, they did a prison experiment that, you know, people debate the results, like the methods that they use, etc. But, you know, I figured I'd just throw this in there because it had similar results as the Jane Elliott experiments, and it was like, you know, I think a shorter time. They had to end it pretty quickly, but I'll leave the link in the description. I got used to saying that, it's my first video. But I'll leave the link in the description to that study, and like you decide for yourself if you want to honor the results. But they did something similar. They took students, they made one batch prisoners, and they made the others guards, and they had pretty much similar results as far as superiority complexes. The guards became like, you know, pretty much jerks, and the prisoners actually started having mental situations, like their mental health was being impacted by that. They had to shut it down because it was getting bad, and it was like after like not even a long time. I'll let you guys, I won't say a number because I can't remember, but it's in the report and y'all see it in the description. So that is directly related to race and police and law enforcement relations, and how we've gotten to the point that we're at today. The next thing, and second to last thing I want to talk about, is the war on drugs. So that really started around the 80s. Around that, it's kind of building up to it before, and it's directly out of all of these other things from slavery, prison industrial complex, et cetera, et cetera. So they started to create the manufactured situation that they wanted to create initially from the prison industrial complex. And, it's other things that are involved that are economic and that hits different issue areas that created a situation that led to the war on drugs. So you start to talk about poverty and different things like that. So like why people are selling drugs and how drugs got there in the first place. That's another story. That's when you start getting into conspiracy theories. But around the 80s, there was a crack epidemic, and it was very lucrative for a lot of people, but destroyed a lot of communities and a lot of folks who were disenfranchised, whether their families have been through the system and it was harder for them to get jobs, or they've been through the system, or the education system hasn't been properly invested in, or they just saw a quick opportunity to make some money as they were living pretty much impoverished due to the systemic racism. That's where that word comes from, because this is all a system. The systemic racism that has been intact since people of color have come to this country. So a lot of folks found their way out. They thought it was going to be their way out through selling or using to cope crack and different types of drugs. Then a report came out that I will leave links in the description if I can actually find that report, but I'll definitely leave some stuff down there about this. But the super predator, so you hear folks who knock Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and all these folks from back in that era where they supported stuff like this. But the super predator was a report from some guy that pretty much said that the babies that were being born during this crack epidemic were going to be like super monster predators, like I guess they would have a cape on or something. It was idiotic to begin with. The fact that people believed this was interesting, but he pretty much said that they were going to be these monstrous, unstoppable, criminal type individuals. He later came out and pulled back his statements. He walked them back and was like, I'm stupid because that was stupid. But it already had an impact because all these different type of laws started to come out that were the tough on crime laws. Youth being charged as adults, a lot of that started to open up around that time, mandatory minimums and all these different type of things that pretty much put people of color, because they are still, as I just explained, disproportionately impacted by the system. So put them at more at risk of being involved in the system, and they did in record numbers. And I don't care what side you on, even Donald Trump is talking about how jacked up our prison system is. So that happened. It had negative results. That's essentially why all of these groups exist. That they couldn't exist if it wasn't a need, because they also are kind of technically, a lot of them actually, are businesses. So they exist to fix this problem because it is a problem. And what that had led to is collateral consequences, where it's generations of families who have never been to college because father locked up, mom on drugs, their grandfather had been locked up, or the grandmother was on drugs. Then they get locked up early because, and now they can't get a job because now they have this on their record, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it really creates this system where it's really in a revolving door, where it's really difficult for people who have systemically been disadvantaged due to racism to ever rise up and for there to be equity. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about briefly is implicit bias. So this is very interesting, and I will leave a link down to some materials that talk about this. But implicit bias is essentially when people are, like, their brains make them like biased, like, they can't, like, it's not something that they consciously think about. And it's implicit bias with several different things, but as it relates to race, I'm going to try to find that report where well, I know Payne and Welch, like they've done a lot of reports on the education system and how it is more punitive towards children of color. But there was a report that I'm definitely going to try to find that teachers were studied like observing adolescent behavior. And what they found was that the teachers were more vigilant and of children of color, and they also saw them as more of a threat or like as a problem before they actually even did anything. So things could be typical child behaviors, and it is more likely that a child of color would be suspended or disciplined in a punitive fashion than if they were white. And again, this is like something you really can't dispute. Like it's something that is a result of all of the factual things that I just explained to you guys. So yeah, pretty messed up system. But now that you know about racism, how are you going to use these tools to foster more collaboration, spread more love, and create more positive change in your communities, whether you're in a mixed race community or you're like completely out somewhere in the suburbs where it's mostly white people? It's okay, we know we are the minority, but how are you going to use this information to make a better tomorrow? If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button below. Also comment, share with your friends and family. Let me know what you think in the comment section. If this is helpful, please let me know by writing helpful below. I really would love to hear your feedback, and let's talk more about this. Like, we need to have these types of conversations. All right, have a good one.